I will discuss the questions of surgery in CBT 2017. So the questions were a little bit atypical, but still these are important topics, and we have seen that many of these questions, these topics which are routinely not taught in the class, they ask in the exam. So that's why these questions have been kept in your exam. So just to give you a little bit more information about these things. Sepsis increases the metabolic needs by approximately what percentage above the normal value? See, in case of sepsis, first of all, we need to know what do you mean by sepsis. See, there is one thing known as SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, in which we know that there is either decreased temperature or increased temperature, increased pulse rate more than 90 per minute, increased respiratory rate, and either leukopenia, that is WBC, less than 4,000 or more than 12,000. So for saying it SIRS, 2 or more than 2 of these should be there. So for SIRS, 2 of the following, 2 or more of the following, it is SIRS. Now sepsis is SIRS plus proved or suspected infection. Proved or suspected infection is sepsis, and septic shock is sepsis with hypotension and perfusion abnormality. So in case of sepsis, basically there is immunosuppression, coagulopathy, microvascular disarrangement. So in case of sepsis, there is increase in resting energy expenditure, increase in resting energy expenditure. Suppose normally if we say it is 100, so in case of sepsis it is around, we can say 150 to 160. So we can say there is increase in 50%. So resting energy expenditure increase is 50% in case of sepsis. So your answer will be B, 50%. In case of burns, this resting energy expenditure, we can say it is around 100% increase. It will be twice, it will be 200. So there is 100% increase in case of burns, major burn. Calorie requirement is also high in burn patient. That was a question, calorie requirement in burn patient. The energy requirement is slightly more than the energy requirement in burns. It is 25 kilocalorie plus 25 kilocalorie per kg per day plus 40 kilocalorie per percentage of total body surface area burned per day. So energy requirement is also more in burn patient. In sepsis also it is more. So in our question the answer is 50%, that is the metabolic needs are increased by 50% in case of sepsis. If it was a question about major burn, then the answer would have been 100%. In major burns, around 100%. In case of elective surgery, around, we can say, 25%. In elective surgeries also, the metabolic needs are increased by 25%. Burn 100%, sepsis 50%. Coming to the next question, which nutrient is proportionately increased in pulmonary failure antral formula? So pulmonary failure antral formula, antral means it is given by the, we can say, the GIT route is followed. The GIT route is followed, so either by oral or by nasogastric tube, or we can give a feeding gastrostomy or feeding jejunostomy. So we are using the GIT route. If we are giving nutrition by intravenous route, then it is known as parenteral route, that is TPN, total parenteral route. So pulmonary failure means there is nutritional supplement in patient with pulmonary failure. Nutritional supplement in respiratory failure patient. So in case of respiratory failure patient, they also need this nutrition. So for these patients, there should be high fat and low carbohydrate diet. High fat and low carbohydrate diet is required for these patients. Now the rationale for using this is, see, if we give low carbohydrate diet, the CO2 production will be less. CO2 production is less. We know that most of this respiratory failure patient, there is carbon dioxide retention. So we want the carbon dioxide level to be at a lower value so that CO2 production is less, respiratory quotient will be decreased, and because of this it favors respiratory, basically patient will feel better because there is less carbon dioxide which is producing inside. Now high fat diet, especially in acute condition, in acute respiratory distress. In high fat diet, there is modified lipids. They will cause eicosanoid production. Eicosanoid production, which will influence the inflammatory cascade. It will influence inflammatory cascade. Inflammatory cascade which is there in the acute respiratory distress. Basically influence means this will decrease the TNF value. Tumor necrosis factor will be decreased by this modified lipids which will produce eicosanoid production. So that's why high fat, low carbohydrate diet should be preferred for the patients with respiratory failure. So our question is, which nutrient is proportionately increased in pulmonary failure? Answer is fats. So fats are proportionately increased in patients of pulmonary failure. Coming to next question. This was a relatively easy question. 70 kg man with laceration of femoral artery loses 850 cc of blood, presents to the emergency with pulse of 101. See the blood volume in a patient, we can say 7% of body weight, 8% in case of newborns, we can say neonates or infants 8%, otherwise in children or in adults 7% of the body weight, or we can say weight divided by 14 is the blood volume. So in this case it is 70 by 14, so approximately 5 liters is the blood volume. The patient has lost 850 cc of this 5 liters. So 850 cc of this 5 liter, it comes out to be approximately 17% of the blood loss patient has. Patient has lost approximately 17% of the blood loss. Now because of this blood loss, patient is having a hemorrhagic shock. So if we see the classification of hemorrhagic shock, we know it has 4 classes, 1, 2, 3 and 4. Class 1 is loss up to 15% of blood loss is class 1. See, to remember this classification, see how the scoring has done. Scoring they are doing in case of lawn tennis 15, then there is 15-30, so 15 to 30%, then there is 30 to 40%, and then more than 40%. So if we see this, our patient is coming in here, this, so patient is having class 2 hemorrhagic shock. 17% will come here. The patient is having class 2 hemorrhagic shock. Now in class 3, BP starts falling. So BP is, hypotension occurs in class 3 or class 4. So hypotension will not occur until patient loss at least 30% of the blood volume. So remember, hypotension occurs if the blood loss is more than 30%. So in this question, answer is B, that is class 2 hemorrhagic shock. Coming to the next question, surgical intervention in a patient with lung abscess should be considered. See, there are different indications which are given. Indications for surgical drainage for lung abscess. Indication for surgical drainage for lung abscess. In any case of lung abscess, first you start the medical therapy. If there is failure of medical management, if the abscess is under tension, if it is under tension, then there are very high chances of it to get ruptured. Increase in size despite treatment. Despite medical treatment, the abscess is increasing in size. Opposite lung contamination. Opposite lung contamination, because of that, more than, we can say, 4 to 6 centimeter in diameter. So you can say 4 centimeter, more than 4 centimeter diameter, indication for surgical drainage. Other indications like multiple abscess, pneumothorax. If it has ruptured, then it will cause pneumothorax, means there will be air and pus. Patient is having severe symptoms like hemoptysis. Then in case of diagnostic uncertainty, diagnostic uncertainty means on the basis of your imaging you are not able to distinguish whether this is a cavitating carcinoma or this is a abscess. So to rule out carcinoma, cavitating carcinoma basically. So these are the indications for surgical drainage. So if we see, if the abscess is more than 3, not 3, it should be 4. If there is slight decrease in size after 2 weeks, so if there is decrease in size, you will continue antibiotic therapy. If the abscess is under tension is the correct answer. Bilateral lung abscess involvement is not an indication, but because of one lung abscess, if there is contamination in the other lung, then there is an indication, because before the other abscess develops in the lung, it is better to drain this abscess. So abscess under tension is the best response in this question. To next, in a patient with symptomatic varicose vein where the GSV has a reflux and a diameter of 9 mm, the preferred surgical treatment is. So the different treatment options are, apart from the conservative management like compressive stockings and avoid prolonged standing, limb elevation, different treatment options is, one is surgery. The gold standard treatment is still the gold standard treatment is surgery, that is Trendelenburg surgery. Trendelenburg surgery, that is flush ligation and stripping of GSV basically. Stripping of GSV. This is the gold standard treatment. Saphnopopliteal junction ligation and perforator ligation in case of perforators are incompetent. These are the minimal invasive method for the treatment of varicose vein. One option is SEPS. Question have been asked on this SEPS. SEPS is subfacial endoscopic perforator ligation surgery. Subfacial endoscopic perforator surgery. SEPS is one option. Then we have options like radiofrequency ablation. Radiofrequency ablation in which thermal energy is used. Thermal energy is used to ablate the vein from inside. Thermal energy will ablate the endothelium of vein. This radiofrequency ablation is a very popular method nowadays because it is minimal invasive. Patient goes home very early and also very less side effect. So the temperature which we use in this is around 110 to 120 degrees centigrade, and the veins are burnt from inside. Maximum diameter of vein in which RFA can be done is 18 millimeter. Minimum is 4 millimeter because you have to put a probe. So maximum and minimum diameter for doing a RFA is this. So RFA is very good option. Same thing, but we are using a laser. Then it is known as EVLA, that is endovenous laser ablation. This is radiofrequency ablation. RFA is radiofrequency ablation. EVLA is endovenous laser ablation. Then there is a newer method which is known as TRIVEX, that is trans-illuminated vein excision. Trans-illuminated vein excision. Sclerotherapy is another method. Sclerotherapy. So these are sclerotherapy is basically done for veins which have very small calibers, like this is for less than 3 millimeter veins. Less than 3 millimeter diameter veins, sclerotherapy is a good option. Not for grossly dilated veins. So if we come to our options, (9 millimeter) sclerotherapy cannot be used. Vein valvuloplasty is not a treatment. Flush ligation of SFJ with stripping of vein, this can be done, and this only two things can be done, B and D. So as I said, nowadays mostly radiofrequency ablation, if possible, if available, this is the most preferred treatment. If there is failure of RFA, then you will go for this. If there is failure, or we can say after RFA there is recurrence, then you will go for this flush ligation of SFJ with stripping. This is Trendelenburg surgery. This is Trendelenburg surgery. Coming to the next question. Which of the following is not one of the 5 principles of surgical treatment of GERD? We know surgical correction of GERD is fundoplication. Different types of fundoplication: Nissen's fundoplication, Tope fundoplication. So there can be complete, that is 360 degree Nissen's fundoplication, or 180 degree Tope fundoplication. These are the common. If you have to do a complete 360 degree Nissen's, Tope is 180 degree posterior fundoplication. So the basic principles which you follow in fundoplication is, first of all, the distal restore the distal esophageal, restore the lower esophageal sphincter pressure twice the resting gastric pressure. Twice the resting gastric pressure. See, in this option it is written 10 times. So it is not 10 times, it is twice the resting gastric pressure. Second, adequate length of distal esophageal sphincter should be there in the abdomen. adequate length of lower esophageal sphincter in abdominal cavity, because there is positive pressure in abdominal cavity. Because there is positive pressure in abdominal cavity, so there should be at least, you can say, 2 centimeter should be there. 2 centimeter of, we can say, intra-abdominal esophagus should be there. If it is less than 1 centimeter, definitely there will be reflux. So at least 2 centimeter of lower end of esophagus should be there in the abdominal cavity. And after surgery, the cardia part of the stomach, we can say, it should relax on deglutition. So the cardia should relax on deglutition. If this thing doesn't happen, then patient will have dysphagia after GERD. So that's why while doing surgery, only fundus part should be taken. The body part should not be taken in fundoplication. Fourth thing is, the pressure should not exceed, lower esophageal sphincter pressure should not increase than the peristaltic pressure of esophagus. Peristaltic pressure of esophagus. See, peristaltic pressure of esophagus, normally it is 40 to 80 millimeter of mercury. So after fundoplication, the sphincter should not be, the lower esophageal sphincter pressure should not be more than 40, otherwise again it will cause dysphagia. So to prevent reflux, if the pressure is, we can say, between 10 to 25, it will prevent the reflux. So normal lower esophageal sphincter pressure is between, you can say, 6 to 25 millimeter of mercury. So if it is more than 40, then definitely it is going to cause dysphagia. So while doing fundoplication, you should not increase the pressure more than 40. And the fundoplication should stay in the abdomen. Your fundoplication, it should not go back into the thoracic cavity. Fundoplication be placed in abdomen without any tension. So these are the principles which we follow while doing treatment for, fundoplication treatment for GERD. So coming back to the question, which of the following is not one of the principles? The fundoplication should be maintained in abdomen by crural repair, that is option number 5. It should be there in the abdomen. So this should be done. Adequate amount of intra-abdominal esophagus should be obtained 2 cm. This is also true. Fundoplication should not increase the resistance above the peristalsis of the esophagus. So this option is also true. Option number B is the incorrect, because it should be 2 times, not 10 times. So option number B is the incorrect response in this. To the next question, in an attempt to teach medical students about a barium swallow. So this is a barium swallow picture you are getting, and the patient is absolutely fine. So a volunteer undergoes this test. So there are asymptomatic, patient is asymptomatic. This is a feature of Schatzki ring. Schatzki ring is basically this is formed of mucosa and submucosa, mucosal and submucosal ring at the lower end of the esophagus. We can say at squamocolumnar junction. So at the squamocolumnar junction, there is a ring which is known as Schatzki ring, symmetrical ring. This ring is basically, the cause for this is GERD. GERD is the cause for this. So this is not a pre-malignant lesion. The esophageal webs are pre-malignant lesion. This is not pre-malignant lesion. Patient can be asymptomatic. Patient can have dysphagia because of this, and there is important thing, a patient can have episodic aphasia. So episodic aphagia is an important clinical feature which might occur in a patient if patient has taken large a bolus which is increased in size. Then this will go there at the lower end of the esophagus and it will obstruct, and patient will have episodic aphasia. So that is short-scaring. Treatment options: if the patient is asymptomatic, no treatment. No treatment means you will start definitely treatment for GERD, but you will not do anything as such furthering. In case of symptomatic patient, you can do Buji dilatation, or we can say balloon dilatation, and you will do a fundoplication, Nissen's fundoplication, to take care of the basic pathology, that is GERD. So dilatation and fundoplication if patient is symptomatic. If patient is asymptomatic, then there is no need of any treatment. So in our question, patient is asymptomatic, he is a volunteer for this barium swallow. So in this case, observation. If patient is symptomatic, dilatation. Incision and resection with end-to-end anastomosis are not the options for short-scaring. Dilatation if patient is symptomatic, observation if patient is asymptomatic. Both the cases you will start treatment for GERD also. Coming to next, which of the following catheter material is most suitable for long-term use? So these catheter material, these are basically perurethral catheter, which is commonly known as Foley's catheter. So this catheter can be of short-term use and long-term use. Short-term use, like patient who has just one episode of retention, you know that this retention will go in next 2-3 days, so you can put this short-term catheter, like PVC, polyvinyl chloride. This is for 14 days. Latex is the most commonly used. This is also 14 days. Teflon for 28 days. Now there are patients who need long-term catheterization, like patient with stricture, patient with BPH who are waiting for the surgery. The patient who needs long-term means you can keep these catheters for more than 12 weeks. After 12 weeks, patient need change of catheterization. Here you need to change the catheter in every 14 days. If patient needs again change in 14 days, patient will come to you, you have to change the catheter. Here the frequency of change will be there after 3 months. This is made up of basically silicone catheter, hydrogel coated catheter. So long-term catheterization is desirable if it is silicone or hydrogel. In short-term catheterization, if you prolong, then there is increased risk of UTI, increased risk of bladder stone. So UTI risk is increased if the short-term catheter are used for more time than the desired. It should be changed in 14 days. If you don't change, then there is risk of infection. So most suitable for long-term use, answer is silicone. To the next question, what is the probable diagnosis in patient with spinal cast presenting with bilious vomiting? This is also known as cast syndrome, also known as SMA syndrome, superior mesenteric artery syndrome, or Wilkie syndrome. This syndrome occurs if suppose this is aorta, this is abdominal aorta, and here is superior mesenteric artery arising from the aorta. Normal angle of this superior mesenteric artery with aorta. Normally it is, we can say, 45 degrees. There is a range, basically we can say 38 to 56 degrees, but to remember, this is 45. And here is the location of third part of duodenum. Third part of duodenum. Now if this angle decreases, if this angle becomes less than 25, this angle, if it is less than 25 degree, then it will be like something like this, and it will compress the duodenum. So if it is less than 25, it will compress the duodenum. This is SMA syndrome. So third part of the duodenum will be compressed. If it is compressed, then patient will have kind of gastric outlet obstruction or duodenal obstruction. Compressed duodenum. So that is Wilkie syndrome. The basic pathology is this occurs because of lack of retroperitoneal fat. Lack of retroperitoneal or visceral fat. So lack of retroperitoneal or visceral fat leads to, there is a fat pad present here. This fat pad basically prevents the direct compression of this SMA over the duodenum. Now if this fat pad is gone, then the SMA will compress the duodenum directly. So this we can say the risk factors are, if there is rapid loss of weight loss, rapid increase in height, like in adolescent males, there is rapid increase in height. Then if there is lumbar lordosis or scoliosis, the patient on scoliosis, they put a body cast on this patient. So because of this body cast, this thing can occur. That's why it is also known as cast syndrome. Prolonged rest. So these are some of the aggravating factors. Treatment option, many times patient is, if you ask the patient to gain weight, then many times the problem resolve. Otherwise you have to do a duodenojejunectomy. You just bypass that compressed segment. Duodenojejunectomy. So if we come back to our question, what is the cause? So the cause in this case is duodenal obstruction. Duodenal obstruction is the cause. The site of obstruction is third part of the duodenum, which is after the opening of the ampulla of Vater. That's why vomiting will be bilious. Which of the following preservative is used while packing catgut suture? See, this catgut suture, this is a natural absorbable suture. Natural absorbable suture, and it is derived from submucosa of sheep. And this is a monofilament suture. Monofilament suture. Now this catgut pack, it contains a liquid, and that liquid is isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol. So answer for this is isopropyl alcohol. This is present in the pack of catgut. Only this suture comes in a packing which has liquid preservative. Rest all sutures, they come as a dry suture. Only this is liquid suture. The other basically these sutures are sterilized by sterilization of sutures is basically done by ethylene oxide and gamma irradiation. Ethylene oxide gas and gamma irradiation. So sterilization of suture is done by ethylene oxide and gamma irradiation. So answer here is isopropyl alcohol, because this is used as a preservative in packing of this catgut suture. So catgut is derived from sheep submucosa. sheep intestine, mucosa. The most pre-malignant lesion of the stomach. See the pre-malignant lesions of the stomach. You can see gastric adenoma, polyps like adenomatous polyps or hyperplastic polyps. Hyperplastic polyps. We can say here is adenomatous polyps in this. Chronic gastric ulcer, atrophic gastritis. Atrophic gastritis, also known as type A chronic gastritis. Then type B chronic gastritis is also a pre-malignant condition. This is due to H. pylori infection. Verrucous gastritis, previous gastric surgery, and Meningitis disease. So these are the different pre-malignant lesion. The question is the most pre-malignant lesion of this. So out of all these, the maximum chances of turning into malignancy is in atrophic gastritis. Around 94% chances of developing malignancy in atrophic gastritis. So atrophic gastritis, the chances of developing malignancy is high. In all these cases it is high, but it is very less in hyperplastic polyps, less than 1% in chronic gastric ulcer. Verrucous gastritis, it is again 1%. So in other condition it is less than 1%. Here it is around, we can say 2 to 3%. And gastric adenomas, the risk is increased if the size is more than 2 centimeter. If there is high grade dysplasia, size more than 2 centimeter, villous adenoma, or if there is ulcerating adenoma. So in these cases there is increased risk. I mean, overall adenoma has increased risk, but the risk is increased many times if patient has these features. So in our option, the most pre-malignant lesion of the stomach, it is atrophic gastritis. In atrophic gastritis, the most common site of malignancy will be in the fundus part. Overall most common site is in antrum, but if it occurs in atrophic gastritis, then it is in the fundus region. Coming to next question. The instrument used in this instrument is used in all of the following procedure. So if you can see the instrument was basically a surgical stapler. The instrument is a surgical stapler, which is also known as circular stapler. So I'm sure this is not showing here, but I'm sure it was in your paper. So this is a circular stapler, and the circular stapler is straight and curved. This is a curved circular stapler. This is basically used for doing end-to-end anastomosis. This is for end-to-end anastomosis. Circular stapler is used. Now see, in case of hemorrhoidal surgery, this is used. The procedure is known as MIPH, minimal invasive procedure for hemorrhoids. MIPH we use. This is also known as stapler hemorrhoidopexy. Stapler hemorrhoidopexy. APR, that is abdominoperineal resection following rectal cancer surgery. Here no anastomosis is done. Here you remove the sigmoid, you remove the rectum, you remove whole of the anal canal, is removed and you make a permanent end colostomy. Permanent end colostomy. There is no anastomosis we are doing in APR. So in APR, no anastomosis. So circular stapler is not used here. It is not used here. Low anterior resection, you do anastomosis. This is low anterior resection. After removing the sigmoid and a part of rectum, descending colon and rectal anastomosis is done. Descending colon plus rectum anastomosis, remaining part of the rectum and descending colon. So this is used. Esophagojejunostomy following total gastrectomy. Roux and Y esophagojejunostomy, this is also used. You will anastomose the upper part of the we can say the esophagus, remaining esophagus along with the jejunum. So wherever we are doing end-to-end anastomosis, this has a very good important role, stapler. So it has no role in abdominoperineal resection because no anastomosis is done there. Coming to next, which of the following statement regarding breast cancer during pregnancy is not true? It is one of the most common cancer during pregnancy is the true statement. Breast conservation surgery can be done if the patient is diagnosed in third trimester. So in case of BCS, breast conservation surgery, basically three things you have to do. You will do a lumpectomy, wide local excision, plus you will do axillary lymph node assessment. If it is enlarged, you will remove. If it is not enlarged, then you can do a axillary lymph node sampling or sentinel lymph node biopsy to see the involvement of lymph nodes. If it is involved, you will remove. If it is not involved, then you will leave it. And radiotherapy. So these three things you have to do in all the patients. So if it requires radiotherapy, then BCS is not for first and second trimester. First and second trimester you cannot use BCS. But in case of third trimester, you do lumpectomy, you do surgery basically, then a patient will deliver and then you will give radiotherapy. So in third trimester, surgery can be done. When the diagnosis is made, radiotherapy can be delayed till the patient delivers. So third trimester it can be given, so it can be used. So this is also a true statement. Safest trimester to give chemotherapy, second trimester, is also true statement. Hormonal therapy, see, any kind of hormonal, targeted or radiotherapy are contraindicated in all trimesters. Hormonal, targeted therapy, and hormonal therapy like tamoxifen, anastrozole, letrozole. Targeted therapy like trastuzumab, lapatinib, everolimus, these are the targeted therapy. And radiotherapy, these are contraindicated in all trimesters. So this is your answer. Hormonal therapy cannot be given in any trimester. Hormonal, targeted and radiotherapy you should not give in any trimester if the patient is having breast cancer. Coming to the next question, in this picture is there, which flap has been marked in the image shown below? See, this is the flap. Which flap has been marked in the image shown below? See, this flap is known as LD flap or latissimus dorsi flap. LD or latissimus dorsi flap. Now this flap, all these flaps are basically by definition the flap has its own blood supply. So this LD flap LD flap or latissimus dorsi flap, this we know that these flaps are based on some blood vessel. So this is based on basically thoracodorsal vessel. Thoracodorsal vessel is the main vessel, primary vessel which supplies this. Intercostal vessel is also a part, but the main is by thoracodorsal vessel. LD flap is basically used for reconstruction of the chest wall and basically breast after modified radical mastectomy. So this is for reconstruction of chest wall and breast. Although the best flap for breast reconstruction is tram flap. So that is another question. What is the best flap for reconstruction of breast after surgery? Best is transverse rectus abdominis muscle flap. Tram flap is based on inferior epigastric artery. So that is the best flap. But LD flap is also an option, especially in those cases where the breast was small and whether the abdominal wall is scarred, previous abdominal surgeries. In those cases, LD flap is used. Serratus anterior flap is based on subscapular artery. Basically, the lower three slips of the muscle is used. So here answer is latissimus dorsi. Serratus posterior inferior flap is based on intercostal arteries. Trapezius flap is based on dorsal scapular and transverse cervical artery. Dorsal scapular and transverse cervical artery. So LD flap and tram flap are two commonly used flaps used for breast reconstruction. The best is tram flap, as I told you, in previous abdominal surgeries, and in small breasts LD flap is used. The next question, identify the knot shown in the image. See, in this knot, the first knot there were two throws. You can see there are two throws and then there is a single throw. So if the first knot there are two throws, then there is one we can say turn, then that is known as surgeon's knot. So surgeon's knot is considered to be a good knot because the chances of slippage is less in surgeon's knot. Another kind of knot, I'll show you just this knot. See, the crossings are same in both the ends. We can see the red thread is going over the blue thread. So crossings are same. This is reef knot or square knot. Again, square knot, another name for square knot is reef knot. This is a good surgical knot. Good knot. Surgeon's knot is a good knot. Reef knot is a good knot. Another knot, that is granny's knot, is a not good knot. This is, we can say, there is risk of like slippage of ligature if you use a granny's knot. In granny's knot, basically the suture, suppose here the both the threads, they will go in the, see, in the upper part. Here it is coming, okay, like this. Here it is coming over it, and here it will go under it. So the crossings are opposite. The crossings are opposite. Granny knot, granny, or you can say slip knot, granny or slip knot. Here in this part we can say red one is anterior to the green one. Here green one is anterior to the red one. So the crossings are opposite. Here the red one is anterior to the blue. Here also red one is anterior to the blue. So crossings are same. That is square knot. This is granny knot, slip knot. This is not a good knot. This is inferior to other knots. And Aberdeen knot is basically, it is applied at the end of a continuous suture. If you are taking continuous suture, at this end you will put a Aberdeen knot at end of continuous suture. We can say this is the knot is more secure than surgeon's knot. More secure. So this is one of the most secure knots, Aberdeen knot. So here the figure is basically surgeon's knot. Two throw, and then one, it is surgeon's knot. Most frequently used nerve in perioperative monitoring. See, perioperative monitoring is perioperative nerve monitoring. Basically, it is done to determine the onset of, to know the onset of neuromuscular blockade. To judge the depth of anesthesia. To judge depth of anesthesia. To know the effect of muscle relaxant. So onset and effect of neuromuscular blockade. And also this is done to know about the intraoperative nerve injury. Like especially if you are doing surgery of thyroid, then recurrent laryngeal nerve monitoring is done intraoperatively. So this most frequently used nerve is ulnar nerve. In general, for perioperative monitoring, ulnar nerve is most frequently used because most sensitive muscle for this effect of anesthesia and neuromuscular blockade is adductor pollicis. Adductor pollicis is the most sensitive muscle. That's why it is nerve stimulation is most commonly done in ulnar nerve. Although it can also be done in median, posterior tibial, common peroneal. Facial nerve is done basically during parotid surgery, facial nerve monitoring. So these nerves can also be used. We just put a electrode in that muscle, and the muscle supplied by this nerve, and we'll see whether the twitching is happening or not. We'll see that electrode and we'll come to know the different amplitudes of this on that monitor. Next question. In the immediate post-operative period, the common cause of respiratory insufficiency could be because of the following except. So in the immediate post-op period, the respiratory distress can be due to like anesthetic reversal agents. Anesthetic reversal agents like naloxone, neuromuscular blocking agents, neuromuscular blocking agents, hypercapnia. Hypercapnia can occur following surgery. You see that PaCO2 will be more than 50. This is 50. Hypoxemia, SpO2 will be less than 90. Hypoventilation, that is respiratory rate less than 8. Then in cases like if there is like abdominal wall binder or splinting of chest or abdomen, laryngospasm, VQ mismatch, So these are the causes. Residual effect of muscle relaxant is true. Overdose of narcotic is true. Myocardial infarction will lead to respiratory distress. Mild hypovolemia will not lead to immediate post-operative respiratory insufficiency. Mild hypovolemia can be easily, we can say, compensated by the body. Patient rarely have any symptoms apart from dry tongue and decreased urine output. There will be nothing to the respiratory system will occur in case of mild hypovolemia. Coming to next, which one of the following is an indication for IVC filter, inferior vena cava filter, in a patient with deep vein thrombosis? See, if we see the absolute indications, IVC filter is not used in all the patients of DVT. Absolute indications are if there is recurrent DVT despite anticoagulation. Recurrent DVT despite patient on, we can say, warfarin or heparin therapy. Recurrent DVT. Contraindication to anticoagulation. So there are cases where you know that the patient is a high risk case of DVT, but you cannot give prophylaxis for this anticoagulation. Prophylaxis in the form of low molecular weight heparin you cannot give. So contraindication to anticoagulation with, you can say, proximal DVT, because this IVC filter basically it will not prevent DVT, it will prevent pulmonary thromboembolism. Pulmonary thromboembolism. This is a filter which is something like this shape, you will put in the IVC. So if a thrombus is going, it will go and it will stuck here, it will not go into the lungs. So that's how it will prevent pulmonary thromboembolism. It will not prevent DVT. The most dangerous complication of DVT is death due to pulmonary thromboembolism. And pulmonary thromboembolism most commonly it arises from the DVT of iliofemoral segment. So iliofemoral segment DVT is the most common cause of pulmonary thromboembolism. So if there is proximal DVT and you cannot do anticoagulation, that is a indication for placement of this. Recurrent pulmonary embolism. Recurrent pulmonary embolism is also a contraindication. So here 45-year-old male, first episode of DVT, you can put IVC filter. 80-year-old first episode, you can put. 55-year-old with recent history of intracranial hemorrhage. So you see patient is having intracranial hemorrhage. So here anticoagulation is contraindicated. Here anticoagulation is contraindicated. So here you have to put IVC filter. In this case there is no need. In this case there is no need. Postpartum period there is no need. But in this case anticoagulation is contraindicated, because here if you give anticoagulation there are chances of rebleed in the brain and it can lead to serious complication. So in these indication, recurrent DVT, contraindication to anticoagulation, and recurrent pulmonary thromboembolism, you have to put a IVC filter. The most very commonly used IVC filter, the name of that is Kimray Greenfield filter. Kimray Greenfield is a commonly used IVC filter. Coming to the next question, which one of the following changes have been incorporated in the 8th AJCC classification of breast cancer? See, in this 8th AJCC, basically the major changes which they have made is immunohistochemically detected tumor markers are incorporated into staging system. are incorporated into staging system. Means the grade, hormonal receptor status and HER2/neu status. See, इसका grade, hormonal receptor like ERPR status and HER2/neu status. Previously it was not included in the staging system, TNM staging system. According to 8th AJCC, this should be included in the staging system. Second thing is genomic assays when available to downstage genomic assays when available, then they should be used to downstage the ER positive and lymph node negative tumor. And the third change is lobular carcinoma in situ is no more considered to be a malignancy. Lobular carcinoma in situ is not a cancer, it is a benign disease now. Although there is increased risk of cancer, but this is not considered to be a cancer. So here lobular carcinoma in situ is now considered a benign condition is the true statement. So it is a treat if LCIS is not a cancer, then if it is diagnosed, then what are the treatment options? So if a patient comes with a diagnosis of lobular carcinoma in situ, treatment options are either we can go for a close surveillance or hormonal prophylaxis, give tamoxifen, or prophylactic bilateral mastectomy. These three are the options for lobular carcinoma in situ. Ductal carcinoma in situ is a malignancy. It will be treated like a malignancy is treated either by a simple mastectomy. If it is ductal carcinoma in situ, it will be a cancer. Treatment is either BCS or you can go for a simple mastectomy. Modified radical mastectomy is not done for DCIS because there is no lymphatic spread. Lymphatic spread does not occur here. Coming to the next question, fine needle aspiration cytology is not suitable. For tubercular lymphadenitis, this is investigation of choice. Papillary carcinoma, investigation of choice. Plasmacytoma, this is used. Aneurysmal bone cyst, it is not used. So aneurysmal bone cyst is the answer. Aneurysmal bone cyst, basically it is a expansile osteolytic lesion. This is a expansile osteolytic lesion of bone, locally aggressive. It is not malignancy, but it can involve the surrounding structures. Here aneurysmal bone cyst investigation, basically X-ray, CT, MRI are different investigations. Biopsy is done here. Open biopsy is done. FNAC is not done. If there is diagnostic uncertainty, then you can go for open biopsy. FNAC is not the option. In case of FNAC, the needle used is between 23 to 27 gauge needle is used. So aneurysmal bone cyst, the treatment options are selective arterial embolization, intralesional injection, intralesional injections of methylprednisolone or calcitonin, radiotherapy, and curettage and excision. So these are the treatment options. Here fine needle aspiration will not work. So if a biopsy is needed, it will be in the form of open biopsy. Rest other conditions, FNAC is very frequently used. To next, the most radiosensitive tumor. Most radiosensitive tumors are basically lymphomas, Wilms tumor, Ewing sarcoma, multiple myeloma, and seminoma and dysgerminoma. These are the germ cell tumors. Seminoma in case of males and dysgerminoma in females. So these are highly radiosensitive tumors. So you can say dysgerminoma is our answer. Other radiosensitive tumors are medulloblastoma, neuroblastoma, head and neck cancers are also radiosensitive. If we see radio resistant tumor, malignant melanoma, osteosarcoma, pancreatic cancer, these are some of the radio resistant tumor. If we see chemo resistant, chemotherapy resistant tumor are stomach cancer, urinary bladder cancer, soft tissue sarcomas, and squamous cell carcinoma of head and neck region are chemo resistant. Chemotherapy will not help much in these tumors. Chemosensitive tumors are Wilms, lymphoma, teratoma, ALL in children, acute lymphocytic leukemia, choriocarcinoma, Ewing's, rhabdomyosarcoma. So these are the chemosensitive tumors. So these are different radiosensitive, radioresistant, chemosensitive and chemoresistant tumor. Dysgerminoma, seminoma are radiosensitive tumors. To next, which of the following statement is not true regarding Fowler's position? The Fowler's position is this position in which the patient is sitting here. So you can say semi-upright position, 45 to 60 degree. Pose. This is the bed. This is 90. This is 45. This is 90. So here between around 45 to 60 degree position, and the legs are straight or it can be slightly bent. Leg straight or slightly bent. See, high Fowler is, this is the Fowler position. If they ask high Fowler position is 60 to 90 degree. Semi-Fowler is 30 to 45 degree, and low Fowler position is 15 to 30 degree. Basically the use of this position is mainly patients of respiratory distress. If you ask them to lie down, there will be the respiratory distress will increase. So here in this position, the oxygenation, it will, you can say, promote oxygenation, because there will be chest expansion. It relaxes abdominal muscle, this position. Elevates compression of the chest because the effect of gravity will not be there. So elevates compression of chest. In postpartum, in pregnant females, it will improve uterine drainage. In pregnancy, improve uterine drainage. In pregnancy means postpartum, after the birth. And this is also used for, we can say, while putting Ryle's tube or the nasogastric tube, because of decreased risk of aspiration. But one disadvantage of this is many neurosurgical procedures are done in this position. Neurosurgical procedures for breast reconstruction procedure, this position is used. The only disadvantage is there is increased risk of venous air embolism. So there is increased risk of venous air embolism. Increased risk of venous air embolism. So this position is true, this is true, this is also true. See, while in neurosurgical procedure this is used because if the patient is in sitting position, in this upright position, then the intracranial pressure is low, and we want intracranial pressure to be low in neurosurgical procedure. It increases the risk of venous air embolism, so option number A is not true. The root cause of majority of wrong side surgeries result from communication errors. Many times there is, suppose patient, the surgeon wants to operate in the left limb, but he is not aware, he was not informed properly about the disease and all, and he can operate on the opposite limb. So these are the wrong side surgeries, patient, and these things occurs because of communication errors. So to avoid these communication errors, there is surgical safety checklist. Surgical safety checklist to avoid this communication error, especially in the OT. So this is done in the OT before you start the surgery. So this is given in 2008, or any OT environment, whether it is gynecological, orthopedic, or any other surgeries, any OT environment, this is used surgical safety checklist. Basically it has 3 components. One is known as, one thing is done before induction of anesthesia. Before induction of anesthesia. Here patient will confirm the identity. You will ask the patient his name, patient will confirm his identity. Then the site of surgery is marked. What is procedure written in the file, you confirm with the surgeon, anesthetist, whether there is consent in the file or not. If there is any allergies, the anesthetist need to know. What is the expected blood loss, so that the blood can be arranged in the blood bank, and whether the anesthetic safety and equipment is there or not. So this is done before induction of anesthesia. Second is known as timeout. Timeout is again this is done before incision. Before you put the incision on patient body, you stop for a while, pause, and all people in room, they introduce themselves, that who is surgeon, who is anesthetist, and what is their role. Surgeon and anesthetist confirms. Surgeon and anesthetist confirm the patient and procedure and the expected events. Need for antibiotic therapy, and if there is any imaging, whether it is displayed in the OT or not. If patient requires antibiotic preoperatively, this is given before incision, and imaging, whether these necessary CT scan or X-rays, whether they are placed in the OT or not. Third is sign out. So before induction of anesthesia, time out and sign out. Sign out is before patient leaves OT. Before patient leaves OT, this is basically done by the staff nurse. All the instruments, whether the instruments are instrument check, instrument sponge, needle count, whether it is complete or not, then equipment check. So these checks, equipment check whether the equipments are ready for the next surgery or not. So these things are, so this is basically the component of surgical safety checklist, which is very important to avoid these communication errors, and these communication errors are very common cause of injuries and common cause of, we can say, the medical negligence. Which operation is not advised for morbid obesity? So according to the definition, morbid obesity is BMI more than 40. So the indications for surgery for morbid obesity is, one is BMI more than 40 or BMI more than 35 with comorbidities. Surgery is known as bariatric surgery. Now there is an absolute contraindication for bariatric surgery. There are other contraindications also, but the absolute contraindication is Prader-Willi syndrome. In Prader-Willi syndrome, patient will have a constant need to eat, and if patient keeps on eating, then there is no point doing a bariatric surgery. So bariatric surgery can be divided into you can say restrictive procedure, mostly restrictive, mildly malabsorptive, and third is mostly malabsorptive, mildly restrictive. So we can divide the bariatric surgery into these three: restrictive, mostly restrictive, mildly malabsorptive, mostly malabsorptive, mildly restrictive. In restrictive there is vertical band gastroplasty, although this is not done nowadays. Vertical band gastroplasty, adjustable gastric banding, this is done. Adjustable gastric band, and laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy. Laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy, very commonly done, one of the most commonly done bariatric surgery procedure. Mostly restrictive, mildly malabsorptive, the options are the surgery done under this is known as Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Roux-en-Y gastric bypass is mainly a restrictive, mildly malabsorptive procedure. Mostly malabsorptive, mildly restrictive is BPD, that is biliopancreatic diversion. Biliopancreatic diversion, and a modification of this, that is duodenal switch. Duodenal switch and BPD are the examples for mostly malabsorptive, mildly restrictive surgery. If we come to our options, partial gastrectomy is done in BPD, it is done in sleeve gastrectomy, it is done in duodenal switch. So this is done. Ileal transposition is not done. Gastric bypass is done. This is not ileopancreatic, this is basically biliopancreatic. So ileal transposition is not advised for morbid obesity. Rest are the options for morbid obesity surgery. Comes to the last question. In order to expose the celiac axis, left renal vein, superior mesenteric artery, and abdominal aorta in case of trauma, choose the most appropriate procedure. So we know that, suppose this is aorta, this is IVC, left kidney, right kidney is here. So over these things, these structures, aorta, IVC, kidney, renal vessels, SMA, celiac axis, these are retroperitoneal structures. Over this will be the GIT, there will be intestine, large intestine. So everything will be going like this. So you won't be able to see these structures. If you want to expose the aorta, or we can say the left side of renal vessel, you have to mobilize this part and shift this to the opposite side so that you can see the aorta and you can see the left renal vessels and left kidney. So for aorta, left kidney and vessel, aorta and we can say branches, and left kidney and vessel, you shift these structures to the right side. So left structures will be shifted to the right side. This is known as left medial visceral rotation. Left medial visceral rotation. This is also known as Mattox maneuver. This is also known as Mattox maneuver. Left medial visceral rotation is also known as Mattox maneuver. Similarly, if you want to see for, you can say, IVC and right kidney and branches, you have to shift these structure to the opposite side. So that is right medial visceral rotation. Right medial visceral rotation, which is known as Kettle-Brach maneuver. So remember, Kettle-Brach maneuver is for to look for IVC and right kidney. Mattox maneuver is look for aorta, its branches, and the left kidney. So here they are asking about aorta and its branches. Answer is left medial visceral rotation or Mattox maneuver. So thank you. These were the questions of CBT. Thank you very much and good luck for the exam.